What's up guys, we're back with another video today talking all about flatbread pizza dough. If you're new around here, my name's Jessica, and on this channel we talk all about the ins and outs of food, not only how to make it, but also tips to help you become better in the kitchen. I'm kind of a snob when it comes to pizza dough because why buy the store-bought stuff when you can make it at home? It's really simple, and what I love about this recipe is that you only need a few ingredients. You let it sit in the fridge to ferment, and then you can literally make your pizza with whatever toppings you want. It's a great recipe, it's really simple, so let's just jump into the video. So first, I think it's important to talk about the distinctions between a regular pizza and a flatbread pizza. Well, I was hoping when I did all my research that I could find an actual definition of what flatbread is versus what pizza is, but it turns out this doesn't really exist. Some people claim that flatbread pizza dough is either unleavened or uses a leavener like baking soda or baking powder to help it rise. And other people prefer their flatbread to have the doughy air bubbles like traditional pizza. And then there were others that defined flatbread pizza by the shape. So if it was shaped as a rectangle, it was considered a flatbread versus a traditional circle pizza. I guess the point that I'm trying to make is that there's not a technical definition for flatbread. It really is whatever you want it to be. So since there is no technical definition of a flatbread, I want to tell you what this specific flatbread dough recipe means and what it's going to taste like. So in this recipe we do use yeast as our leavener. I like the lift that it gave to the dough, and I think it adds a really nice complex flavor. We'll talk about in a minute, we actually allow the yeast to cold ferment in the fridge, and if you let it sit for up to 5 days, it actually almost develops like a sourdough taste. It's really good. The second thing about this recipe is that it makes 2 flatbreads. So they're kind of individual sized flatbreads, and I personally like to shape mine square, although there's no rules here. And finally, I like to roll out the dough. So usually with traditional pizza, you don't want to actually use a rolling pin to roll it out because you want those nice air bubbles. But for this recipe, I found that I almost prefer it being rolled out so that way the dough stays nice and thin. So now that you know what to expect out of this recipe, let's jump into actually making it. There are a few ingredients that you'll need for this recipe, including bread flour, active dry yeast, fine sea salt, olive oil, Greek yogurt, which I forgot to throw in this picture, as well as some sugar. Now, if you know anything about yeast, you know that it needs time to reactivate if you're using active dry yeast. So we're gonna first start out by getting half a cup of water. You want this water to be around 110 degrees. Make sure that it's not too much hotter than that. If it's above around 120 degrees Fahrenheit, then you will kill your yeast. So be careful about this. If you're really good at testing the water temperature, it's about lukewarm. You can get it from your sink. If not, what I prefer to do is throw it over my stove and gently heat it until it reaches 110 degrees. Some people prefer to do this in the microwave, but I will warn you that the water gets really hot really fast, so just make sure to check it with an instant read thermometer if you're doing it this way. Alright, so now that we've got our water, go ahead and add the sugar and the yeast and just mix it all up together. We're gonna let this hang out and sit for about 5 minutes until it becomes frothy and foamy on top. This is how you know that you have good yeast that has activated. If you don't see the foam, you probably have yeast that's too old, that's sat around too long. So make sure to throw that out, buy some new active dry yeast, and start over with this process. If not, your flatbread dough won't turn out correctly. Alright, moving right along, we are gonna grab our bread dough. Now the reason that I opted to use bread flour instead of all-purpose flour was because bread flour has a higher protein content in it. Now what this means is that the dough is gonna turn out a little bit chewier and crunchy, which in my opinion makes a better flatbread. Now just for comparison, bread flour has about 11 to 13% of protein in it, versus the all-purpose flour that we normally use has about 9 to 11. So if you're new to protein content in flour, just remember that the less protein it has, like a cake flour, the more tender and delicate your baked good is gonna be, versus the higher protein flour, like our bread flour, is going to give you a chewier baked good. So grab your bread flour and mix it with your fine salt. The reason we're using fine salt is just to make sure it gets evenly distributed throughout the whole dough. Once your water and your active dry yeast has become foamy, you can add that to the flour mixture and just mix it with a rubber spatula. All we're doing here is forming a shaggy dough. So all of the flour is not gonna get mixed with the water at this point. So no worries there. Then we're gonna add in your olive oil and your Greek yogurt. You can do this at the same time and then keep mixing. The dough at this point is still gonna be pretty shaggy and you might still have some bits of flour that aren't incorporated. That's totally fine. At this point, make sure you have a clean work surface and clean hands, and then you can move the dough out of the bowl and onto your work surface. We're gonna slowly start kneading until all of the flour has been incorporated. Once the flour has incorporated, start a timer for 5 minutes and we're gonna knead by hand. This is gonna help the gluten structure form in our flatbread dough, so don't cut this time short. Now that the 5 minutes is up, you can see that the dough looks a lot more uniform and smooth and really put together. So at this point, we are going to grab a bowl about medium size and oil it up with some olive oil just to make sure that the dough doesn't stick to it. You can form your dough into kind of a rounded ball, place it in the bowl, and then cover it with plastic wrap. Now this is where the fun part comes in. Normally you would need to allow the dough to rest in a warm place for about an hour to allow it to ferment, so that way the yeast activates and it starts working and making the dough rise. Well, with this recipe, we're actually gonna work on something called a cold fermentation. So rather than having to heat up your house, especially if you're making this recipe in the summer, what you can do is just throw it in the fridge. Cold fermentation essentially does the same thing as a warm fermentation. However, it just takes a little bit longer for the process to happen. So during this time, the yeast is eating the sugar and producing carbon dioxide. This takes a little bit longer in the fridge, but the trade-off of waiting is that it's going to give you a more complex flavor in your dough. But the cool thing about this recipe is that you can actually allow the cold fermentation to keep working for up to 5 days in the fridge. So this recipe is great because if you want to prep it ahead of time for a party or a get-together, you can do that and allow it to sit in the fridge for multiple days at a time. Personally, I actually like the taste of the dough after it sat in the fridge for 5 days. It gives it kind of a complex, almost sourdough taste to it. It's really delicious. All right, so at whatever point you want to pull out your dough, now it's time to talk about how to bake it up. So you'll grab your dough out of the refrigerator about 30 minutes to an hour before you want to use it. This is gonna give the dough some time to warm up so that way it's easy to roll out. If you forget, no big deal. It might just be a little bit harder for your dough to roll out. But I do like to use a rolling pin on this step just to make sure that we get a nice flat and crispy flatbread. So we'll actually be turning our ovens up to 450 degrees Fahrenheit, which is super hot, but if you've ever been to a pizza restaurant and they have that nice, beautiful pizza ovens, you'll notice how hot they get. Obviously, we can't get our home ovens that hot, but we want to get it as hot as possible to encourage nice browning, a crispy crust, and all that nice gooey melted cheese on top. Now for this recipe, I don't have specific toppings that I have in the recipe card on my blog. This is kind of up to you to use your creativity or to find another recipe as far as the toppings go. But really, you can do pretty much anything. The possibilities are endless. The other great thing I love about flatbread is that there aren't as many hard and fast rules. So if you don't want to use the sauce, you can opt for just spreading some olive oil on there and then just putting your toppings and your cheese. Kind of do whatever you're feeling at the moment. Lately, I have been loving having some olive oil on the bottom along with some roasted garlic paste spread out, and then feta and green olives and shallots on top. It's so good. Once you have all your toppings situated, you can pop the whole flatbread in the oven for about 10 to 15 minutes until everything is nice and golden brown. I hope that you enjoyed this recipe. There are lots of delicious toppings, flavor combinations that you can make with this flatbread dough. So I hope that I can see your creations. And if you want the full recipe, go ahead and visit my blog, linked in the description below. If you enjoyed this content, please hit the subscribe button and keep your eye out for more videos like this. All right, I'll see you next time.